In the summer of 2020, during the global COVID-19 pandemic, Netflix released the documentary Athlete A. That unbelievably sad story, told by a group of extremely brave young women, sent shockwaves around the world and right through the sport of gymnastics. During my 21-year career in the sport of gymnastics, I trained, competed, and observed many of the different cultures that exist within my sport, and this is my story. So back in the year 2000, when I first started gymnastics, I guess it's important to kind of talk about the context of the time. And it was back then, 23 years ago, the world was a different place, you know. We didn't have smartphones, we didn't have social media, the internet wasn't around. And I guess it was a time when we were kind of almost coming out of that era of where people would say things like children should be, you know, seen and not heard. And I even remember having a swimming lesson when I was younger. And I wasn't very good at swimming when I started out. And the teacher used to smack me over the head with a float. And back at that age, I've spoken about this before, like I struggled to concentrate, so I'd always be messing around. And when they'd throw those like colourful magic stick things in, and I'd be off looking for them before the teacher told me to. And she used to smack me over the head with a float. And I'd come back after the session, I told my mum, I said, "Mum, that swimming teacher keeps hitting me on the head with a float." She was like, "What are you talking about? There's no way she's doing that." I was like, "Next time, watch her." And so next swimming lesson I have, true to form, she smacks me over the head with a float. And I don't think the swimming teacher lasted much longer than that. And I finished swimming lessons. That was my last swimming lesson. But it kind of tells you a bit about the time. And, you know, gymnastics wasn't a unique sport. You know, in recent years, there's been lots of athletes coming out to share their experiences that they had through sport in many different sports. I think swimming's the latest one. You know, it's been athletics, gymnastics, football, you name it. And back then, I think context is important. And when I started gymnastics at 7 years old, and I walked into a gymnastics club for the very first time, like I said, it was a very different world. Now, I think it's important to note that the gymnastics club that I walked into was very different back then, and it had a different name. It was the Knott School of Gymnastics, and the setup there was incredibly different than what it is like now. There were 4 separate sports, essentially. So you had the men's program, the women's program, the recreational side, and the sports acrobatics side. And they were all separate, but they were in the same building. And when I started gymnastics, it's not until I look back now and my dad says, "God, yeah, it was a little bit odd." And I do these talks now with my dad where we go into gymnastics clubs and we try to help other parents, and they ask us questions about what it was like back in the year 2000 when I started, when I was a kid. And it was very different. You know, the attitude at the gym kind of at the time was that parents aren't allowed to come inside the gym. So there's no viewing gallery at Knott's. There wasn't back then. And there's just 2 double doors with 2 pane glass windows, and the parents would stand there and they'd watch what's going on inside. But really, you know, they couldn't really see what was going on. And a lot of the children and a lot of the kids that were training there were training 5, 6, 7 hours a day. And a lot of those practices that you kind of hear about, they were there, they were commonplace, you know. I think gymnastics for sure attracts a certain type of personality, especially on the boys' side, you know. So I wasn't unique, you know. I was a hyperactive kid, had a lot of energy, was getting in trouble, you know, probably with my parents, not doing what I was told, and also getting in trouble at school. And gymnastics kind of brings those types of characters in because it welcomes them with open arms, because more often than not, they're the types of kids that are going to be really good at the sport. And have some of the fundamental characteristics that will really help them moving forwards when they get into their gymnastics. So yeah, gymnastics certainly attracted me, and a lot of the boys in the gym at the same time were very similar, super hyperactive, kind of alpha males within their groups and classes at school, loved sport, struggled maybe with school to concentrate, but in the gym when they used their bodies, that all kind of made sense to them. And it certainly, gymnastics took a lot of that energy away and helped them learn a lot of really useful skills. But I remember at that time some of the cultural things that would go on, and you know, there was I can remember once I got put in a box, and it's you know, I laugh now, but and it was an inexperienced coach, and I was training on a Saturday afternoon. I think I wasn't listening. I was messing around with something, and you got them old school box tops. So they're like the ones that you get in school, where it's got like a lid on top of it, and it's different sections. And so I went inside this box for, I don't know, maybe half an hour, and I'm in this box and I can see through like the gaps of light, and I just thought it was hilarious, because when you got put in this box and you'd come out, it was like you were getting street cred from all of the lads like in the group. But you know, you wouldn't dream of doing that now, 23 years later. That's crazy. But back then, that was just kind of normal. And there were lots of odd things in the gym at the time, you know. There was one of the things you always used to be frightened of was forgetting your shorts. Because if you forgot your shorts to train in, you'd only have your tracksuit bottoms and you'd warm up and you'd see how long you could get through the session without anybody noticing. Once the coaches noticed that you didn't have your shorts, the head coach at the gym at the time would threaten to put you on the beam in your underwear and make you walk across the beam and join in with the girls as a way to like ridicule you, which is crazy. Like looking back, that sounds bonkers. You know, if people listening will hear that, I'd be like, oh my God, that exists. But it did. It was just commonplace. It was the kind of way it was, you know. And there was a lot of stuff around stretching as well. So when I was a kid, I was really stiff. I wasn't very flexible, and I never really was that flexible, especially in my shoulders. But the kids that would struggle with splits, like me, there'd be like 2 wooden boxes, and you'd sit there in a straddle sit, it's called a japana, and you'd have these 2 big wooden boxes, dead heavy, right? You'd struggle to lift them up if you were a kid. You'd need to use 2 people to lift them up. 1 at the front, 1 at the back, and you'd have 2 grown adults, 1 at the front, 1 at the back, and they'd push the box in until you were in splits. Which, yeah, it's like some medieval torture technique, but that's the type of stuff that used to go on back then. And it was just normalised. It was commonplace. It wasn't anything different. It was happening at every single one of the gymnastics clubs or the elite gymnastics clubs around the country. And it's stuff that I'm sure still probably in some ways carries on today. Not like that. But I think the stuff that I witnessed in those early 2000s, and for sure, like a lot of this stuff has come out in the last few years. I think when I look at like the women's side, it was heavily focused on weight. It was a lot of weight stuff from a very young age. You know, you had like young girls with weight jackets on and ankle weights just running and doing laps around the floor. And like, I can't imagine, I'm sure it was framed that was for cardio and stamina and endurance, but it wasn't. Just try and make sure that they keep their weight off them. And there was even like weighing scales in the gym. So I remember one morning, a girl being put on the weighing scales and being ridiculed in front of all the other girls because over the weekend she'd put some weight on. And I think for me, that was just, yeah, that was really hard. That was hard to see. But the scary thing was how just normal that was, and how, as like on the men's program, we were very separate to the women, like I said. We just accepted that as normal, which is crazy, you know? And I think my brothers and sisters, they knew because they all tried gymnastics. So my younger brother did gymnastics, and he kind of went, no way, I'm not having a grown adult tell me what to do or sit on me to do splits. Like, I'm not doing that. And he quickly stopped. My sister did the same thing. My younger sister, a funny story, my younger sister used to have this cuddly toy. It was like a monkey. And to get her to do any gymnastics, the coach used to have to get the monkey and swing the monkey around the bar to get my sister to go on the bar. So Olivia didn't last too long, and Isabel did a bit of like mums and tots and stuff. But again, it wasn't for her, you know. And that goes back, I think, to explaining how it attracts a certain type of person. But yeah, seeing that with the young girls that was always hard to see. And the thing that was really sad looking back, especially on the women's side, was that they always looked sad, man. They always looked miserable. They never looked happy. And like, as much as a lot of the stuff that, you know, I experienced on the men's side was not okay, and it was definitely like it was where we were at, I think, in many ways in society at that time. You got to look back then, like, it was commonplace for, you know, adults to shout at kids and, you know, probably smack kids a lot of the time. When I was younger, that was around. So it was a different time, and context is really important. But for the girls and the weight stuff, yeah, I don't think that's never okay. And yeah, for me, I always looked at that as like a lack of knowledge and a lack of expertise and technical knowledge, you know? It's just such an easy thing to say, oh, you can't do that because you put a bit of weight on, or, you know, I never understood that. And they just always, like I said, they always looked unhappy, man. They always looked sad. And as much as like it was tough and we worked really hard and we were training extreme hours, and back then, you know, I was training 6 or 7 hours a day. I was taking time out of school all of the time. The girls were doing this as well. You know, missing our education in many ways. But the lads, most of the time, we were always happy, man. We're having the time of our life. We're having a laugh. And, you know, we'd play football all day long and we'd get up to mischief and we'd go to training camps. And because we were like probably the most wild kids in all the schools locally, and then you put all these wild kids together, we'd just come up with crazy ideas and we'd be off. You know, we're like the Lost Boys out of Peter Pan doing stuff. In our break times, we'd be wandering off like into, there used to be like an abandoned house in the field behind the gym, and we'd go there and like jump into the swimming pool and like make fires and do all sorts of mad stuff. So as much as it was, there were certainly things that weren't okay and that don't exist now. There were practices that thankfully are long gone. We were having a great time and we were all happy most of the time and having a laugh, and there were smiles on our faces. We were just working extremely hard and we were under an extreme amount of pressure. But for me, looking back, like on the women's side, yeah, they just never looked happy. You know, it was a lot of pressure and I can't blame them. Like if they weren't eating much, I'm sure they were absolutely exhausted, you know, and they were training 6 or 7 hours a day. Plus they're going through puberty and dealing with things that boys don't necessarily deal with, you know. So they're like kind of, and then I guess like the contradictions, like I said, like, but the cultures in gymnastics that were brilliant were, you know, when you come into a gym, it's all about respect. Like everybody's on a level playing field in some ways, maybe not the kids to the adult relationship, but, you know, I learned how to win. Gymnastics taught me how to win, how to lose. It taught me about consequences. It taught me that work ethic was really important if you ever wanted to get anywhere. It taught me about goal setting, you know, camaraderie, like having teammates, how important working together is, you know, and some of that would have been, our bond will have been formed through the struggles of those difficult times and those difficult days. But, you know, for me, there was so many positives, but there's always two sides of a coin. And what was really interesting was when I left, and like I say, I got to stress again that back then it was called the Knott School of Gymnastics. It was very different, and there were 4 separate clubs within one building. And at that time, the boys and the girls really didn't get on. And when I say the boys and the girls were fine, but the men's senior coach and the women's senior coach essentially hated each other. So they had their own little issue. They had their own issues going on. And, you know, I saw shouting matches and screaming matches and incredibly unprofessional with like hundreds of kids in the gym and swearing at each other and all sorts. It was terrible. And they used to like put that into us and tell us don't ever talk to the girls, don't get along with the girls. You know, it was really weird looking back. It was odd. And then when I moved to Huntingdon in 2007, that was really strange for me because it was such a different culture there. And when I got there, I was completely just gobsmacked that the boys and girls would warm up together. Because like in our gym, we weren't even allowed to talk to the girls. Like to the extent where like if the girls were on the vault and they had a vault session and maybe they were running like a minute late and we had a session, like we would be told to just push them out the way and just run down the vault run, which is nuts. And then I get to this new gym in Huntingdon and the boys and girls are training together and warming up together and like working together. And it was a real like family community gym. That was so alien to me. And my parents said the same thing. Like even getting to Huntingdon, there was a viewing gallery so the parents could see everything. That was odd because in the gym back in Nottingham, like I said, there was just the 2 double doors. And if a parent would come in the gym, there'd be a coach on them straight away saying, "What are you doing in here? You can't be in the gym." And, you know, I'm sure they'd frame that as it being a safeguarding issue. But there was no health and safety or welfare officers or safeguarding back then. That didn't exist. All it was a control thing. So that was alien, like going to Huntingdon. But some of those ideas and like common themes, they were still alive in that gym. They did exist, you know, especially like the women's side, like I said. There's a lot of common threads that just was woven into gymnastics over many years, I'm sure. And in many ways back then, you know, the sport was new in terms of it wasn't very popular in this country, you know, especially on the men's side. I've told you before, when I started, we weren't great at gymnastics. It wasn't very popular. It was never really in the public eye. The women's team had quite a good team. They would normally qualify a team to the Olympic Games, but they weren't really winning medals. It wasn't until Beth Tweddle started doing really well on the international stage they got a bit more limelight, I guess, and TV time. So it was an amateur sport, and the coaches that were there, you know, weren't getting paid a lot of money at all. A lot of volunteers back then, you know, not a lot of highly paid jobs and coaching roles within gymnastics anywhere in big clubs or even on a national programme, I'm sure, back then. But yeah, this Huntingdon thing was really strange for me. It was odd and it was great. I loved it. I loved, you know, being friends with the girls in the gym and kind of working together. I think that was a really cool thing and something that was brand new that I hadn't experienced. But like I said, there was still those things were there. You know, the weight, you know, just seeing like girls training and crying all the time and, you know, boys doing it as well sometimes because it was tough. And you're going to be emotional because you're training 6 or 7 hours a day. You get kids that are going through puberty and they're teenagers. They're going to be upset and they're going to find it difficult. But yeah, there was still some of those things existed and they were alive back then for sure. And I guess moving on to like what the culture was like at the top on the elite level, at national training camps, you know, 8, 9 years old, you start leaving home and you stay for weeks at a time at the National Sports Centre or in satellite sports centres, and you've not got your parents, so you're in complete, you know, you're under the supervision of the national coaches that are there. They're your responsibility, and a lot of it was the same stuff, you know, a lot of the same things that happened in the clubs was happening at these national camps. And again, it comes back to being younger and remembering what it was like, especially with the girls. And I even remember like the Rhythmic team were based at Lilleshall National Sports Centre, and Rhythmic was like a whole new kettle of fish. The girls were telling us at the time when they were like 13, 14, they were saying, oh yeah, we eat like an apple a day. And I'm thinking, what? You eat an apple a day and you train like 5, 6, 7 hours? How do you do that? How's that even possible? And the girls there at the time, they would be so hungry a lot of the time, and their coaches would be on them about the weight and stuff. They'd be starving and they'd want to eat chocolate, which I understand that like chocolate and stuff isn't, you know, it's not best suited to being an athlete, but they're young. They're burning so much. Imagine training 6 hours a day, how many calories you're burning. So we used to go and get the chocolate bars from the vending machines. We'd walk behind the back of where they were staying. They'd open their windows and we'd throw chocolate bars through the windows for them to eat because they'd be starving. And when we go to the shop, when we were older, when we were 17, 18 and we could drive, they'd ask us to get them food from the shop. That's pretty nuts, really, looking back. And even stuff like, I remember at one time, kind of a little bit later on, there were like grown women who were representing Great Britain who were being given like dinner, like children's dinner trays that you would get at primary school with like really small sections, and they were only allowed a certain amount of food, and the coaches were watching this and like, I just thought, this is nuts. It makes no sense to me. Like for me, that was more a reflection of the coaching. You know, if you're struggling to get a gymnast to do a certain skill that they used to do when they were younger and they were lighter, maybe it's a technique issue rather than the fact that they've put some weight on. Like, I just never understood that for me. Like, I don't get it. I still don't understand that. I don't get it. And yeah, so it was difficult, and we were training, you know, we were training extreme hours, like I said. And I think the thing that changes as you get older and you become an elite athlete. And again, we're going to these training camps, right? And like I said before, like the lads in the club gyms are probably locally and in their community and around their schools are the kids with the most energy or most hyperactive. Then you take the kind of the best of those lads and then get them from all over the country and put them together. So, God, at Lilleshall training camps, we used to cause carnage, man. Whenever we weren't training, we were up to mischief all of the time. We were in the woods playing. I used to love it, man. We'd go into the woods and we'd make fires and we'd make dens and we'd climb on the roof of the big building and we'd sit on top of the roof like however many stories high, and we'd look out at night time in the dark and we'd take like gloves and hats and we'd all dress up in black and then climb up the roofs and stuff. It was amazing, you know. A young lad. It was brilliant. And we were always just up to no good. But there were, as we got older and it got more serious, you know, and you're starting to get results and we were getting medals and we were getting success, I think the system that's in place is a system that really values medals and results above all else. And I'm talking about back then, and all of this that I'm explaining, this was my experience, and I know that I had a very unique experience, right? So I trained before school. Not a lot of kids did that in a young age. I left home at 14 to live with another family. That's a huge commitment. So my experience was very different to some of my friends, but it was an experience shared by a lot of athletes, you know, and the system, like I said, that's in place very much it's just built to value medals, success and winning above everything else. It is. And it's because, you know, the way Olympic sports get funded is off their success during that Olympic cycle and the medals they win at an Olympic Games. So that pressure on the people that are running those programs is huge, because you've got to keep that success and those medals so that everybody down the chain gets paid. And that's a lot, and it's complicated. It's definitely not black and white. And that pressure, you know, you're in a situation where you've got lots of adults under extreme pressure influencing young people. And that's tough, you know. I'm a strong believer that you only really see what people are made of when they're under pressure. It's easy when things are okay, right? But when people are under pressure, you see how they act and how they react to certain situations. And everybody makes mistakes, right? But there's a lot of stuff within that system that the way it is built, it just doesn't value the right things, in my opinion, you know? And yeah, for me, there was always just, as I got older and I started making a living from gymnastics, you know, I think the first post-2012, you know, we'd just gone to the Olympic Games. We'd done incredibly well. We'd won the first team medal in 100 years. And from that point, I've spoke about this before in a previous video, I'm going to get put onto the A-level funding because I'm now an Olympic medalist. And we had a meeting just post-2012. And we sat in this room, and the performance director at the time had a conversation with us all. And he said, look, guys, unfortunately, we're going to be taking £2,000 off your yearly salary that you get given from UK Sport Lottery funding. I'm 19. I've just been to the Olympic Games, just won a medal, you know. And I'm thinking, what? Why is this happening? Why are they doing this? And there was no explanation. They wouldn't give us an explanation. And actually, the explanation I got given was, and bearing in mind, I'm 19, right, in a room full of adults with my teammates, and we're all confused. Like, why is this money getting taken off us? I don't understand it. We've just gone and done something incredible for the sport of gymnastics and British gymnastics. And they said, no, we don't want to talk about money. It's not about money. This shouldn't be a question about money. You do this because you love it. And I'm like, what? I'm turning around and saying to the people next to me, my teammates, I'm saying, I think we should have like our parents in this meeting or an agent. And we asked for that, but they said, no, this is the one time we're going to speak about this. We don't want to talk about money at all after that. And then, yeah, they took £2,000 off our lottery. I don't know what it was for. Maybe they'd have an explanation for me, but back then it was, you're the child or the youngster, you know, you don't need to know that. And yeah, that attitude, that carried on for the whole of the rest of my career. And the way it's set up is that, you know, essentially, if you are the best athlete in the country, the best gymnast, then you have a bit of leverage. Otherwise, you kind of don't. That's a really difficult position to be in, you know, and it was tough. And again, post-2013, I made history in 2013. And this really comes back to the belittling you and your achievements, and it's just a control thing. That's all it is. I know it's that. And I remember after 2013, I'd made history in Moscow. I'm the first British athlete ever to win a high bar medal, you know, and 2 years prior to that, I'd been the first British athlete ever to qualify for a final at major championships on the high bar. And I win that medal, and I can remember overhearing a conversation right next to me, and the national coach at the time, he knew I was there, and he said to my coach, Sergey, he said, it's just a European medal, it doesn't count for anything. I can remember feeling like, oh, I've worked my whole life for that. Like, that's an amazing achievement. I'm the first British man to ever win a European medal, and he's just said it doesn't mean anything, doesn't count for anything, it's just a European medal. I thought, what? That just seems so wrong and so backwards. You know, 5 years before that, we'd have done anything for a European medal, and like now it's just like that, it doesn't mean anything. So, yeah, that upset me at the time, but I think that tells you a lot about kind of like the way things are structured and the view and I guess the attitude, certainly towards the athletes. And we carried on, you know, 2014, I went to and had my injury at the Commonwealth Games, and after that, you know, I was starting to wise up a little bit. You know, I wasn't so naive, and, you know, all of this stuff was still going on, especially on the women's side. This was around the time when they were getting the dinner trays and stuff. And I knew a lot of this because my ex-partner was a gymnast. She was a two-time Olympian, you know. So I had a bit more of an insight into the women's side of the program, and, you know, we would talk about it as the men, and we'd say, this doesn't seem right. What's this all about? But it was so normalised from such a young age. I don't know why we just never said anything, you know. And yeah, I guess we were busy doing our own thing. Like everybody, you've got your own. I was under extreme pressure from all angles, all of the time, just to keep my funding. I was getting paid. You know, I'd come back early 2015. You know, I'd just literally had surgery. My ankle was shot to smithereens. I'd been working 8 hours a day to get back, and I can remember warming up on the floor with a whole group. Max was right next to me, and we were at the end of our warm up. We'd do a standing back somersault, right? And my ankle wasn't ready to do that yet. You know, I'd started doing a bit of plyometric work and jumping and rebound jumping. My ankle really wasn't ready to do a standing tuck back, you know, just at the end of the warm-up. National coach at the time comes round and says, Sam, where's your tuck back? And I said, I can't do it yet. My ankle's not quite ready. And he just went off saying, nobody cares about your injury. It doesn't matter anymore. Like, nobody cares. You've got to get back. And I'm thinking, what? Like, I've just... You know, I'm busting a gut to try and get back here. Like, what are you talking about? And it was stuff like that was just, you know, it was all the time. It was on at you, those little comments that just, you know, a real lack of empathy and humility and understanding the context of what somebody's been through. And I guess where I really saw it, and it opened my eyes. And up until this point, you know, post 2014, I had to believe that, you know, if I work harder than everybody else, I'm going to get it. I'm going to make it to the Olympics in Rio 2016. After the injury that I had, you know, that career-threatening injury in 2014, I was told, this is it, Sam, you might never do six pieces again. So to have got all the way back, I had to have this faith that, do you know what, if I put all the work in and I do everything possible, you know, I'll make it onto the Olympic team. And, you know, what happened. I wasn't selected for the team, and it was after that I really saw the system that was in place in all its glory, I think, and the way I was treated after that was not okay. It was pretty disgusting in many ways. You know, I'd had a review meeting after that with the CEO, technical director, head national coach. I essentially had to sign a form to say I would never talk about the contents of that meeting, which is crazy, right? Because you never sign something like that unless something's gone wrong normally. But yeah, we kind of made peace. They accepted that I was going to commit myself to the next Olympic cycle. But we'd had a friendly competition after the selection had been made for the Olympic Games. So this was in between Rio. And it was a friendly competition with France, I think. And there was the Olympic team, the three reserves, and the French team. You know, at this point, I'm going through hell, not slept for 2 weeks, hardly trained. And I decided that I was going to try and I was not going to let anybody put me down or you know, try and belittle me or bully me. I'm going to do my full routines. I made a couple of mistakes, you know, but I went out and did my full routines that I'd done at the Olympic trials 2 weeks before, and the other two reserves didn't. They did easier routines, you know. But I was like, no way, are they getting the better of me? I'm going to do my full routines. I had a couple of mistakes, and after nobody spoke to me. Not a single coach shook my hand, even acknowledged me. Any of the personal coaches there, it was horrible, man. It was just a horrible atmosphere to be part of and to be put into that situation, you know. And these are grown adults acting like children, in my opinion. And one of the national coaches, I'd just finished, I was packing my stuff up, I was obviously dead sad. I just wanted to get out of there as quick as possible. And he shook one of the other reserves' hands, and he looked at me while he shook my hand. And he said, well done, mate, you're the first reserve now. And he said it to me in my face, you know, it was at me, it was aimed at me. I just thought, what the hell, man? Like, I'm a kid, I was only 23 at the time. And yeah, that's where I really saw it in all its glory, and it wasn't a pretty sight. You know, this carried on for years later, and I think it's summed up in a conversation that I had in 2017. I had a meeting, I'd just tore my hamstring, and one of the national coaches at that time, he said to me, look, Sam, you know, you got some brilliant ideas. Maybe if you could get some results behind you, people might start listening to you. And I thought, what? Why do I need to be a gold medalist to have good ideas? That makes no sense, and it just shows you what was valued at that time. And I think when I look back now at summer 2020, and, you know, it was obviously the Athlete A documentary that gave a lot of other young people courage to kind of think about their own experiences. And I think that COVID pandemic was massive for lots of people. I think lots of people, for the first time in their life, had sat back and really assessed themselves, where they were at, what they were doing with their lives, and kind of the experiences they'd been through. And I'm honestly, I think if the COVID pandemic hadn't happened, a lot of the Me Too stuff wouldn't have come out. And I just think a lot of people had the chance to sit back and think about their experiences and think about how maybe it was affecting them. And it was, there were some incredibly brave people that came out and spoke and shared their experiences around that time, you know. And the Athlete A documentary started that off, but it spread all around the world. And in gymnastics, it was going on in Australia, in the UK, in the Netherlands. It was everywhere. So, you know, this really was a common... This wasn't just an isolated case to one country. It was the sport of gymnastics, and the sport of gymnastics needed to change. And I think now that it was under the spotlight a lot more, and especially in this country, it's on TV 2 or 3 or 4 times, you know, a year. And ultimately, those athletes at the very top, the best athletes that are competing at the World Championships, the Olympic Games, the European Championships, what they're saying about the sport trickles down through the whole pyramid. And that's the message that the public get on TV, you know? So if you've got athletes coming out talking about their experiences, saying it's not okay, that's what people perceive the sport to be like. And that does trickle down from the very top all the way into the clubs. It does, you know? As much as, like, those kids can be inspirations, and they are, all of them are role models, right? It also, if they're saying, well, I wasn't treated, like, fairly, this wasn't okay, I was abused... like, that filters down through the whole system, you know? And so during that time, they were incredibly brave. And I think one of the athletes for me, it was a guy that, you know, throughout my career, I trained with him for years and years, and he was an unbelievable guy. And his name's Dan Keatings, and he was very brave. And in 2018, Dan came out and shared his experiences way before the Athlete A documentary, and he was on his own. He was just a one-man band, and he stood there on his own, and I'm sure he took a lot of heat for it. I'm sure he was very nervous, but what a brave guy, you know, incredible. And for me, in 2018, one of the national coaches, they lost their job, and it was to do with, you know, what Dan had come and spoke about. And, you know, I can back Dan up. A lot of that happened. It wasn't okay. And I remember being in the gym at the time, and it was really odd because this was 2018, 2 years after 2016, and in many ways I just bottled everything up from 2016. You know, it wasn't there. I became a very, like, numb person. And Josh in the gym, Josh Champion, he said, "Oh, have you heard the news?" I said, "What?" And he said, "Oh, such and such has lost their job." I was like, "What?" And I kind of, like, just was in a bit of a daze, and I got to my car and I drove back home from the gym, and I just cried my eyes out. And it was like the biggest weight had been lifted off my shoulders, because it was like almost, I was right. What happened back then wasn't okay. It was kind of, you know, not that I'm never out. I'm not out to get revenge, but for me, you know, that was kind of like some justice. And I'm sure that's what some of these girls and boys that have come out and spoken the last couple of years have felt like in many ways, you know. And my experience are very unique. Like I said, they're very different to everybody else. But yeah, what a brave guy he was, Dan Keatings. Amazing, incredible athlete. One of my favourite memories ever was in gymnastics. I think it's the most proud I've ever been of anybody else competing. It was in 2014, the Commonwealth Games. Dan was dealing with a lot of these issues that then came out 4 years later. And he was under a lot of pressure. And I'd just shattered my ankle into smithereens, and my mum and dad had picked me up from Glasgow, and we were making the 6-hour journey down south. You know, I was as low as I could possibly be, and my dad put 5 Live on, and the pommel horse final came on, and at that point, Max and Lewis were the two. They were going head to head for the Commonwealth Games gold medal, and Dan Keatings comes and does probably one of the most beautiful, perfect, difficult pommel routines that's ever been performed, and beats them both and becomes a Commonwealth champion. And for me, that was the proudest I've ever been of somebody else. I just had a big smile on my face, even though my ankle was in absolute pieces. I knew I was going to go through surgery. I was incredibly proud of him. So I'll always be grateful for Dan that he was so brave in 2018, because, you know, that led on to me feeling like I should come out and share my narrative during the COVID-19 pandemic period of time, when Athlete A had been released and all these young boys and girls were coming to share their experiences. Now, it was difficult because at this time, I was also dealing with a lot of personal issues. You know, I'd had therapy 6 months prior. I was still struggling with my depression and anxiety. You know, there was a lot of people coming to me. I was getting hounded by the press every day. So they were ringing me, ringing my family's house, trying to get me on TV to share my story because they kind of felt like they knew that I had one. They did a similar thing after 2016, actually, with the Olympic Games. And I didn't like that, you know. I didn't like that intrusive kind of like journalism. And I never felt that, I always worried that, you know, when you get put in front of a TV camera like this, you're not in control of that narrative. They can steer that conversation in any direction they want to. So I actually said to Sam, I'd like to do my own video and talk about my experiences. And I focused on different things. I really focused heavily on the mental health stuff. And I spoke about in the previous episode when I wasn't, you know, when I reached out and asked for therapy and support for my mental health and it was declined. That's what I spoke about and focused on. And I also focused on some of the things that I felt could help the sport and positively benefit. Because for me, it's really important, right? I want people to get their kids into gymnastics. Like, that's what I do right now. I go into schools. I've just starting gymnastics coaching at David Lloyd, and I'm passionate about the sport and I believe in it. And I do genuinely think that gymnastics is a net positive for society and for the younger generation. It is. There's so many beautiful things and positive things about gymnastics, but there are a lot of things that have to change and still need to change, I think. And for me, some of those things that I spoke about back in 2020 still stand, you know. Some of them have changed. I think on the women's side, the FIG should be changing the age limit to 18 like that. It should have changed it like that. You know, your children, under the age of 18, if you need parent supervision to sign a document or get permission to do anything, you're a child. And I think that changing that age limit to 18 is a really good idea. It's a smart thing to do. I think you would definitely encourage young girls to have a longer career. There wouldn't be so much stress and pressure on coaches to have to force gymnasts through by the time they're 16, because they could really think about long-term goals rather than this rush to beat puberty and get to the Olympic Games by the time they're 15, 16. Like, for me, you could change that overnight. That's a big one. School as well. I still feel strongly about that. I know that there's definitely... We're kind of leaning towards kids not taking much time out of school now, but I'm pretty sure it's a legal requirement for kids to stay in education till they're 18 now. So for me, definitely at a minimum, nobody under the age of 16 needs to be taking time out of school, especially if it's at a club, right? If they're going on an international competition abroad, then sure, you can get a letter signed off, you know, for the school, but training every single week and taking time off school, you don't need to do it. I did it for years of my life. From when I was in year 3 at school, I didn't need to do that. There are enough hours in the day and in the week to do enough training. And actually, if you train smarter, a lot of those, I was training at sometimes 35, 40 hours a week, but it was wasted time. I was doing so many repetitions of things. I was doing hundreds. It was like a volume game I was playing. But actually it meant that by the time I was 23, 24, my body was on its last legs. It was gone. You know, you can do enough training in 25, 30 hours a week. So I feel really strongly about the school thing. I've spoke about that before. I think that's something that everybody should kind of strive for. And there are other things as well, you know, and even things that have changed. I know things have changed already. I certainly feel like the value, look, we've got to teach kids that winning is important, right? Because life is a competition, but there's a way in which you can win. And I think really focusing on the values and principles and morals and winning in the right way is super important, like, for me. And there's so many things that far outweigh winning. I think our job as a sport is to make sure that we help nurture these young people so that when they turn 18 and they go out into the real world and they're adults, they're well-rounded individuals that can deal with life and the challenges of life, and they'll positively impact society. That's super important for me. And education's massive making sure that we educate young coaches, young athletes, young people is really important, because you're only ever going to hear my story, right? Because I'm an athlete that made it to the very top, and you might hear the top athletes talk about their experiences. But for every one of me, there were 500 other kids that did everything I did up until the age of 15, 16, 17, 18, and then will go out into society and have an impact on that society and the people around them. You know, that's super important, because it's not a coincidence that a lot of the lads that I grew up with have struggled as they've become adults with their mental health, depression, anxiety, gambling, drug addictions, alcohol. That is not a coincidence, you know? So that is why it's very important that this needs to change. And gymnastics is a very different sport because you're working with children. There are not many other sports where kids are doing 6 or 7 hours a day. That's a full-time job for an adult. So it's very, very important that they're protected, and we think about their well-being, because you're going to do gymnastics for 20% of your life, maybe. If you're lucky, if you carry on that long, you're going to have another 80% of your life left. So it's really, really important to emphasize the right things and really make sure that we put, you know, the young people's best interests at heart. Yeah, for me, I'm really passionate about that. I know that it was interesting just finding out different things. I did a safeguarding course with this guy when I started getting into coaching. And getting into coaching, it gives you another insight on, you know, a different view through a different lens. You know, for many years, 21 years, I had the lens of an athlete, and now I was seeing the sport through the eyes of being a young coach. And I did a safeguarding and welfaring course, and I was gobsmacked that. So this blew my mind, this did. And it's changed now from what I believe. Someone might be able to correct me if it's not changed. I believe it's changed. But at the time I did this safeguarding and welfare course, it wasn't illegal for a gymnastics coach to have a relationship with a 16-year-old kid as long as they weren't in their group. And I'm like, going, what? That's crazy. They're a child. What? That's not... So things like that, I believe that's changed already. So we are moving, and we're making lots of changes, and everybody that's come out and been brave enough to share their story, it moves the needle further in a positive direction, you know. And the great thing about the last few years and everybody, you know, being brave enough to share their experiences, the young men and women that have, it means that people like British gymnastics are now under the microscope. And all the other Olympic sports where there's been stories of this that have come out, they're now being watched all the time, which is brilliant. That's great. That's important, and that's the way it should be. And so that's been a massive positive, I think, that's come from people sharing their incredibly difficult and at times, you know, really upsetting stories that have massively impacted their lives. And I think, yeah, that education thing is huge for me, just educating people, you know. And I understand that people make mistakes, right? But for me, there's a clear difference between, you know the difference between right and wrong. And there's a culturally, society was, it's in a different time period. That's just what everybody did back then, to like, yeah, that's not okay. I know the difference between that. Most people do, I think. And yeah, like I said, for me, I love gymnastics. You know, I'm invested in the sport. It's my job to encourage kids to get into gymnastics. And the great thing is that towards the end of my career, I saw that change, because I came back to Notts when it had completely changed to the Notts Gymnastics Academy. It was now one club. The boys and the girls and the recreational side worked together. And I remember walking around in my first week and saying to Josh, who's this woman that keeps walking around? It was so weird for me to be back in that gym and to see what looked like a parent wandering around, because that would have never happened back in the day. And he said, that's the welfare officer. She comes in here to have a look and make sure everything's okay and talk to some of the kids. I was like, oh my God, that's brilliant, man. So that change is taking place. And a lot of clubs have reflected on a lot of their practices and stuff. And like I said, it's on the young coaches and the new generation to be on it. And the really important thing needs to be that there needs to be safe lines of communication for people to report bad practices or things that they don't feel is okay. That's really important, right? Because of that system that exists as an athlete, that if you have the most medals and you're the best athlete, you have all the power and the leverage. That exists in coaching as well, because the things that we value in coaching is the coaches that have the most experience have won the most medals. So you imagine being a young coach in a new gym, and you might see a really experienced coach do something that you don't think is quite okay. You go up to them and you say, who do you go to? Like, there needs to be pathways for that. I think there is now. British Gymnastics is putting that kind of stuff in place. And I think there needs to be first the awareness of an issue, then there needs to be accountability, right? And there has been some accountability. You know, gymnastics has had the White Review. There are coaches that have been, you know, that have had to step away from the sport and they're not allowed to coach anymore. And the next thing is that change. And you have to give people the chance to change, right? Because everyone makes mistakes. And it seems to me like the new CEO of British Gymnastics, she's really front of house, front of camera. She seems like she's determined to, you know, really improve the culture within the sport of gymnastics. They put things in place, and time will tell now whether that comes into fruition. I hope it does. Like I said, I'm not in this. I want gymnastics. I want every kid in the country to do gymnastics. I think it's an incredible sport. So I'm invested in trying to improve it and make sure that we move forward, because that's really important. But it is also important to acknowledge things that have happened and the truth. That's super important. Otherwise, you know, it's not fair on the people that were brave enough to come out and share their stories. So I'm really glad that I was able to do this. I'm going to dedicate this episode to all those young men and women that came out and shared their stories. It's incredibly brave. It makes a huge difference, you know, and it's made a massive difference. I know this because I get messages all the time from young men, young women, adults that used to be gymnasts that say, keep sharing your story. It really does make a big difference. It's been a great episode. Thank you for listening to the Sam Oldham podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode and you really found some value in it, and I'm going to see you in the next one.